So well, let's welcome to the stage Dr. Serena Bray.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I was here about 8 years ago to give a talk and part of a different series. So it's nice to be back and see all the incredible improvements you've made, and to see such a vibrant campus with so many amazing students. So as Professor Oxley mentioned, mine is on. Back away. I've been working on the topic of the ethics of refugees for a long time now. And in particular, I've spent the last 10 years or so trying to argue that we, in fact, have moral obligations to refugees, how we should think about these obligations, and then how they can become part of our practice, our policies, how we respond to various refugees' crises. So I thought, several months ago when Professor Oxley invited me, I thought I would give a similar talk and try to do my song and dance for why we should have obligations. We should think of ourselves as having obligations to refugees. But of course, things have changed very recently, and I want to acknowledge that there's a new reality and there's a new sense of how we should think about refugees that's emerged in the advent of the last election cycle and the election of Donald Trump. And the reality to acknowledge is that we've elected a president by popular vote whose one of his main platforms was the villainization of immigrants and refugees as well. And as well, he did that in 2016. And this was something that went unquestioned and was in many ways popularly supported by large groups of people. So what I thought I would do today is, instead of giving you a sort of philosophy lecture on why we have moral obligations to refugees, to really back up and talk about a lot of the terms that get used in our political discourse, spend some time defining them, explaining them, and then go through maybe an overview of why some people think we have obligations to refugees, and acknowledge that there are good reasons that some other people think that we don't, and we have very limited obligations to refugees. So that as you go out into the world and you think about refugees over the next 4 years, you can have a very nuanced understanding of the situation, the complexities of the problem. So a lot of concepts have been thrown around for a long time, but certainly in the last election cycle. And the words that have been used are refugee, asylum seeker, immigrant, deportation, this concept of we should be controlling our borders, and to some extent human rights. And what I want to do is just go through all of these terms and explain how they interact with each other, what they actually mean as opposed to what, how they get used in the popular media and on social media, and how we might want to think of them going forward. So the first distinction I want to draw your attention to is the distinction between a refugee or an asylum seeker and an immigrant. So refugees and asylum seekers aren't synonymous. I'm going to explain the difference in a minute. But for now, I want to draw a broad contrast between refugee and asylum seeker and immigrant. So a refugee is somebody, the sine qua non, the core of who they are, is that they have been forced to flee their home, and they have a well-founded fear of persecution. So that's the legal term. If you come and you claim asylum, what you're going to be evaluated on is whether you have a well-founded fear of persecution. And the persecution has to be on the basis of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. Now, if you are a refugee or an asylum seeker, there's actually a robust set of protections that come from international law that are by and large recognized by most countries in the world, including our own, for the most part. But to be clear, no country has an obligation to admit refugees. This is something that the international community has tried to do on the basis of consensus. Countries came together at the end of the Second World War and realized that, in fact, it was unjust to let people who had been displaced because of war simply roam the earth without a home. And the international community had some obligation to do something nothing about it. But they didn't tell states what exactly the obligation was, and states ever since have been free to either accept refugees or to not. So there's no obligation to admit refugees. But if you are an asylum seeker in a particular country, take the United States, if you've come to the United States and you've said, I'm an asylum seeker and I have a well-founded fear of persecution, if indeed you do, you actually cannot be deported. You cannot be sent back home to your home country. I'll explain that more in a minute. Of the people who come to the United States, refugees form a small sliver of the total number of immigrants in the United States. So the term immigrant is a much broader category, and it refers to any person who lives in a foreign country for any reason. Oftentimes we talk about economic migrants or economic immigrants, people who come seeking better opportunities for themselves. But again, states have no obligations to let immigrants in. Most countries have a kind of immigration policy. Some of you might be here on student visas. Some of you might be here on work visas, and those work visas might convert into permanent residency in some cases. So this is a principle called national sovereignty. It says that a legitimate state has a right to determine who is going to be a member of the state. And it might have a robust immigration policy and want to encourage people, and it might have a closed immigration policy and want to really restrict who comes in. But nonetheless, whatever immigration policy you have, you cannot violate the human rights of the people who are on your territory, regardless of whether they're here legally, whether they're undocumented, whether they're asylum seekers, any category that you put them in. States have obligations to all people on their territory. So let me now give you the distinction between a refugee and an asylum seeker, and what you'll see is, in some senses, this is going to get to one of the core problems that have emerged in the US. So if you are a refugee, by definition you have left your home country and you have gone to another country to seek refuge. In most cases what that means is that you've gone to a refugee camp and you've registered with the United Nations. You said, I'm a refugee, I've fled this country, this is why I fled, here are my family members. And you have to wait in wherever the UN tells you to wait until either they can find another country to resettle you or you're able to return home. The United Nations, so the US, for example, if they're participating in the resettlement program, will go to the UN and say we'd like to resettle some refugees. The UN will give us a dossier, or however many dossiers we'd like. The State Department, will spend up to 2 years screening each individual, every child, every man, every woman, every person that is potentially going to be a refugee. And once we decide that yes, this person is a legitimate refugee, we've checked their security background, we'll allow them to resettle in the United States. The United States government does that whole security screening process, but once they arrive in the US, the government gives them very little help, and a handful of charities have emerged to take over and help them integrate. But once they're here, they're always here legally, or they've been given authorization to come. They're literally brought by the State Department to the United States, and they're given a path to citizenship. Historically, the US has resettled more refugees than any other country till 2016. We went back up a little bit under the Biden administration, and we anticipated going down. And that number is roughly 100,000 per year. An asylum seeker is somebody who is slightly different. An asylum seeker is somebody who comes straight to the United States from wherever they're from and asks to be considered a refugee. And once they claim asylum, they cannot be deported until a judge has determined whether or not they have a well-founded fear of persecution. So what this means is that you're going to be processed, you're going to be fingerprinted, there's a background check, a series of interviews with asylum officers, and then they're going to determine, are you or are you not a legitimate asylum seeker? Are you really fleeing persecution? Are you an economic migrant? Are you here for some other reason? And again, there's an extensive screening process, an extensive security process. You're well documented the whole time. And while you are here, while you are waiting for that determination, you are here legally. You are not an illegal alien. You are here legally because you are seeking asylum. The wait time in the United States is about 4 to 6 years, which is part of the problem, because if you're not a legitimate asylum seeker, it takes a long time for you If you're not an asylum seeker, if you're found to not have a well-founded fear of persecution, you can then be deported. But if you are, then you are on a path to citizenship, and then you are considered a refugee. The challenge comes in telling immigrants apart from refugees. You know, on the extremes, a refugee and asylum seeker is somebody who's forced to flee their home, or they've fled civil war, they've fled extreme violence, they've fled genocide or some kind of persecution. On the other extreme, you have an immigrant who chooses to come to the United States, maybe applies for an H-1 visa, to work in Silicon Valley or something like that. But for most human beings, you're somewhere in the middle. You might not technically be somebody who's fleeing persecution on the basis of race, religion, nationality, membership in a political, membership in a social group. But nonetheless, you are fleeing gang violence that your government can't protect you from. You're fleeing domestic violence from a country that does not criminalize abuse of women. You might be fleeing extreme poverty so extreme that you will die if you remain in a place. You might be fleeing poverty because of climate change that has created droughts in your ancestral lands, and you simply cannot farm there anymore, and there's no other place in your country that you're allowed to stay. So technically you're not a refugee, but you really don't have anywhere to go. And it might be a little bit less than that. You might maybe be able to stay, but life is really, really difficult where you are. So there really is a gradation of people. And different states have different protocols for determining who is going to be considered an immigrant and who is going to be an asylum seeker. And remember, what's at stake here can be life or death. Because if you're an asylum seeker, you get to stay and you get to have safety and security. Life is extremely difficult because of all that you've gone through and you're starting with nothing, but you at least get a chance. If you are in this middle group that I'm describing and your livelihood at home has been destroyed, you fear for physical safety from gangs or a brutal husband, and if you go home, you know you will be killed, but you might still be sent home. Like that, it can be because you're told you're an economic migrant and you're not really a refugee. It can be life or death. So the problem then is that what happens is that many people fleeing desperate situations, and I don't really have time to go into different countries in particular, but you might be fleeing, politically unstable country with no chance of security, no chance to escape the kind of violence that you're dealing with, but you're seen as an economic migrant. And the reality is that economic migrants also come with people who are fleeing safety. So they show up at the border, and the job of the government is to determine who should stay and who should leave. Here's where human rights come in. So human rights is a concept that is as ancient, and in part of every ancient civilization has some concept of inherent human dignity, and the idea that there are just some things you should not be able to do to a human being just because they are human. So they're the rights we have that are independent of nationality, race, citizenship, any other kind of status. And they're based on this idea of inherent moral worth. At the end of the Second World War, the international community, including the United States, in fact, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was spearheaded by Eleanor Roosevelt. The international community comes together and says, look, we really need to solidify this idea of human rights. We need to put it in international law, and we need to make it binding on countries. And the U.S. is party to a lot of international human rights law, which means that we have agreed to follow the principles of international human rights. And in fact, we've led a lot of the human rights movements around the world. And so we are bound to protect human rights. Even if you don't care about morality, we're bound by international law, we're bound by precedent and custom and jurisprudence to uphold human rights. So like I said earlier, there's no human right to immigrate, and states do not have a right to have an obligation to let you in. You have no right to just go wherever you want around the world. If you've traveled, you know you have to apply for visas to get into certain countries. Depending on what kind of passport you hold, you may get it or you may not get it. So you don't have any right to enter. But if you were in another country, if you were visiting on vacation, if you were here as a student, if you snuck into a foreign country without documentation, it doesn't matter why you were there. The state cannot violate your human rights. So there's no right to immigrate, but states cannot, there are a whole host of other rights that states cannot violate. They cannot arbitrarily detain you. They cannot torture you. They cannot deny you due process. They cannot discriminate against you based on race, nationality, etc. And there is a human right to seek and enjoy asylum. So here's the problem, right? How do you prevent people from coming in? Actually, let me go up. How do you prevent people that you don't want coming into your country in an undocumented way? So this is where a concept called deterrence comes in. So deterrence policies are a set of policies designed deliberately to make coming to a country difficult, dangerous, and sometimes deadly. An example of this is the Remain in Mexico policy, which said, if you want to come to the United States and claim asylum, fine, but we are going to return you to Mexico, where you will have access to no resources, you will not have, you will not be able to work and take care of yourself, you will not have protection from gangs and other kinds of bad actors who are at play there. And the goal of these policies is to deter unauthorized migrants. And the problem is that while they might deter unauthorized migrants, they also deter people who have a well-founded fear of persecution. Or let me put it differently, they prevent asylum seekers who are fleeing desperate situations from arriving in the United States. Or Europe, Canada, Australia, the European Union, all of the Western countries do this, 100% of them. They prevent asylum seekers from exercising a fundamental human right, which is the right to seek asylum. And the worry is that this is where our national sovereignty, our right to control our borders, comes into conflict with human rights. Because many of the deterrence policies are based around the violation of human rights. So closing safe routes, prevent people from accessing safety. The way these policies have played out have required that migrants need human smugglers in order to access safety, and they take people on dangerous routes, people die at sea, people die of dehydration in the desert, and of course, very infamously, under the last Trump administration, the separation of children from their parents was used as a method to deter migrants, and was considered by a number of international institutions to be a form of torture, to be a form of psychological torture. So you might think, oh, what do we do? What moral obligations do we have to immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers? And I think the question today is even more basic. Do we have moral obligations? Can't we just do whatever we want to them within the confines of the law? And if the law doesn't support us, then why can't we just change it? So I want to try to answer this question. So if you followed me until now, you'll get that when we talk about immigration, we're actually talking about many different groups of people. People who come for various kinds of reasons, and people who have maybe different claims to be admitted to our country and to our protection and our rights and our freedoms and our economic opportunities. But at the same time, we do still have national sovereignty. We do still have the right to control our borders and determine who is going to come and who isn't going to come, and on what terms and what ways, etc. So let me go into philosophy for a minute here and talk about some of the different ways we can ground moral obligations to refugees. So I want to say that broadly speaking, philosophers have given us three different grounds. So again, a refugee is somebody who has fled their home in desperation and has come to you and said, if you send me back, I will be tortured and killed or worse. Why should we let them in? So the first reason is the principle of humanitarianism. It's sometimes called the principle of the Good Samaritan. And the idea is just, if somebody is in desperate need of help and you are in a position to help, you ought to help them, just for that very reason, not because of who they are, what they do, their citizenship, their relationship to you, but just because they're a human being in need. The second reason is more connected to past injustices. Sometimes this is called the Pottery Barn rule, you break it, you bought it. So if you invade another country and you cause a bunch of refugees to be created, well, you actually have an obligation to those refugees. After the Vietnam War, this was a moral grounding that actually had a lot of persuasive value. When the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, worked for the US Army as translators are going to be killed first and foremost by the Taliban. Like, they're the people the Taliban are going to immediately kill. We have an obligation to give them asylum in our country because they helped us do what we want to do. So we have this connection to them. Some other people have tried to make larger connections to various kinds of other past injustices. And this is something intuitive, right? If you've hurt somebody, one way of repairing it is to make it up to them. When we're talking about international politics, if you can't be helped in any other way except to be allowed into your country, then that's what you ought to do. And I'm just going to skip the final one. We're going to 4:15, is that right? We're going to 4:15. So philosophers are not in agreement about this. There are many people who say, look, it might be the case that refugees are in desperate need, and we should think about our moral obligations to them, but we don't have strenuous obligations to refugees. And the first argument is one that I think will resonate with a lot of people, at least from what we hear in popular media. We have a right to control our borders. We have a right to political self-determination. So no matter what we're going to use it for, but like, we are a democracy, when we are a citizenship, we are a body. And just in virtue of that, we get to decide, do we want to let in 100,000 people a year or 4 million people a year? And we can give you reasons for that, but it's so important to us to be able to have self-determination. It's the very meaning of democracy. Right? Democracies would be a joke if we weren't allowed to do the things that we voted for our leaders to do. So we should control our borders. We have a right to control our borders. The second argument is something similar. Instead of looking at political self-determination, they say, look, our culture is our culture. And yes, cultures change and develop, but again, we get to say what cultural influences we want in our country. And if we don't want people from a certain culture, if we don't want too many people from a certain place, well, that's our prerogative, because culture is really important to people. And we have nobody has a claim to say that they get to take over our culture. So again, we get to control our borders, we get to limit immigration. And the final argument is a similar idea. The idea is that as individuals, who we associate with is so fundamental to our autonomy that we get to decide who we want to marry, for example, is an example of freedom of association. I get to decide who I want to marry, nobody can force me to, and that's so important to my ability to determine the future of my life and live the kind of life that I want to live. So on a political level, it's the same. It's so important for countries to get to determine who they are going to associate with, that it grounds an obligation, it allows us to say that we do not have a strong obligation to take in refugees. So there are, I think, some xenophobic reasons to restrict immigration, some racial reasons to restrict immigration, but there are, at their core, fundamental reasons connected to democracy that would allow us to restrict immigration. But here's the rub. None of the philosophers, like not a single one, disagrees with the claim that we owe something special to refugees. Again, because refugees are a particular subset of immigrants who have nowhere else to go, they cannot return to their home country for whatever reason, countries that can take in refugees simply have some obligation to. It is up to countries to determine what that obligation is going to amount to, but they have some obligation to let them in. But again, even if you are on the side of people who think we have limited obligations to refugees, that we have some human rights-based obligations to them is clear. So going back to this idea of deterrence policies, are these justified? Well, some people will say that yes, look, if I have a right to political self-determination and I want to control my border, and the only way I can do it is through these policies. Yeah, they're going to hurt people, they're going to harm people, children are going to die, but political self-determination is so important, we ought to be able to do this. And the assumption, of course, is that we cannot control the border without implementing these cruel policies. You might guess the criticism is that it doesn't matter what your political objective is, you simply cannot violate human rights. And many people have said that this is a principle you want to hold on to, even if you're not an immigrant or a refugee. Once you allow governments to trump human rights, sort of a pun, that was not intended, once you allow governments to violate human rights for the sake of a political objective, there's no reason why they would stop at foreigners. Right? Why not then supersede the rights of minorities? And not just minorities. Why not supersede the rights of women in order to achieve a political objective? So we all have an interest, a very strong interest in making sure that governments balance political objectives but insist on human rights. There is an argument that's come up in recent days which says, look, the backlash against immigration is so strong that it actually threatens democracy itself. So in fact, deterrence policies are justified not for the sake of political self-determination, but just in order to keep democracy viable. I'll just put that out there as a possibility. So that's the background when we talk about immigrants and refugees and our obligations to them. There's an overlap between categories. They're morally complex, and there are legal obligations that extend to all states that are much more complex than I think people really understand. So I want to go back in the last 15 minutes and talk more specifically about refugees. And I want to try to answer this question that a lot of people ask, which is, given these horrific deterrence policies, why do people keep coming? We see boats crossing the Mediterranean, people going over in dinghies without life jackets, hundreds, thousands of people drowning at sea. Why do they keep doing that? I think to answer that and to really understand what's going on at a global level, we have to understand what happens to refugees in the 21st century. To understand that, I need to tell you what's supposed to happen to them. So, after the Second World War, the modern refugee regime is born, and the international community, by consensus, almost entirely everyone agreed to this, said, look, there are three options for a refugee if you fled your country. And remember, they're imagining Jews fleeing the Holocaust. One is voluntary return. We've rebuilt your country, everything's good, you can just go back home. Maybe the United Nations will help you return and find your home and so forth. The second option is local integration. So maybe you move to a country next door, and you've fallen in love, you've gotten a job, you've learned the local language, so then you should be allowed to just integrate and become a citizen of that local country, of that country that you're in. And the third option, which I didn't really think was going to be a serious option that anyone would need, they thought the first two options would be sufficient, was resettlement in the third country. So you can't go home, you can't integrate. Okay, international community, let's get together and agree we'll take those people, those really hard cases of people who can't ever go home, and resettle them in our countries. Now, the reality of durable solutions in the 21st century is this. Fewer than 1% of refugees are ever resettled in a given year. So fewer than 1% in any year are resettled in the third country. Over 85% of refugees are hosted in the global south and developing countries. And when I say hosted, what I mean is that they're not integrated, they're not citizens, they're not allowed to work and live and have families and go to school and go to local hospitals. They stay, I'll explain in a minute, in refugee camps or in urban centers. But they're not restarting their lives, they don't have any sense of permanence. Fewer than 2% of refugees are able to return home in a given year. That's a complicated one, but it has to do with the sort of international globalization of conflicts. And the length of time that you're likely to remain a refugee is 17 years on average, and about 25 years if you're fleeing war. So in other words, if you're a refugee, it's not a temporary matter of a few months, or maybe even a few years. It's like roughly a generation. If you have children who are refugees, this is going to have an incredible development impact on who they are, their ability to be educated, their ability to one day return to their home country and help to rebuild it. So I said that about 85% of refugees are hosted in developing countries, and I just want to highlight that for a moment here because I think that's somewhat surprising. Both in the United States and European Union, people tend to think that everyone is coming there, like they're being overwhelmed by immigrants and refugees. But the truth is actually far from that. Most refugees are in the global south, as I mentioned, Iran, Turkey, Pakistan, Uganda, Russia, Poland. Germany has climbed this ladder because of Ukrainian refugees. So these are primarily Ukrainian refugees. and some Syrian refugees. But notice the numbers, right? Iran, almost 3.5 million, Turkey over 3 million, Pakistan 2 million. Again, you're getting the picture. Here is a graph that includes where the United States and the UK and other European countries fall in this. So we're way down here. So we have about a little under 400,000 refugees and asylum seekers in the United States compared to 3 million. And those other countries are much poorer, much more densely populated than the United States is. So really, if you become a refugee in the 21st century, what can you expect from the international community? What are your options? And I'd like to ask my audience in this circumstance to really imagine yourself in this situation. I know it's really hard because we live in safe places and we feel secure, but imagine if you were in a politically unstable country, you felt that you were being persecuted for your religious beliefs, your political beliefs. There was violence that wasn't being punished. What options would you have? So you would have 3 options. The first is refugee camps. The second are what are called informal urban settlements, sometimes urban slums. Camps are run by the UN, urban slums. You just go figure it out for yourself, maybe try to find some friends or family, work under the table to try to survive. And then the third option are taking these dangerous and often deadly journeys to seek asylum in a Western country. That's it. Right? That's all you can hope for if you're a refugee. And each option, I would argue, fails to provide refugees with the minimum conditions of human dignity. Not a full life, not integration, not citizenship, not luxury, but just the minimum conditions of human dignity. So let me tell you a little bit about each option. So refugee camps, in some sense, are a relief. If you're fleeing war in the immediate aftermath, you show up in a refugee camp, you can get some food and a place to sleep, that's great. The problem, of course, is they become these long-term settlements. You have to give up your autonomy in order to stay in a refugee camp. You can't come and go as you please. You can't live where you want to live. You have no freedom of movement. You're not allowed to work, so you're entirely dependent on the charity that comes from the United Nations, but then also these other non-governmental organizations. And the food is very meager at best. And there's a tremendous amount of gender-based violence. And remember, this is not like a transit house. Like this is years or decades of your life that you're going to be living there. So there's a scholar who spent 10 years in Dadaab in Kenya, and he describes this refugee camp as a groaning, filthy, disease-ridden slum heaving with traumatized people without enough to eat. Crime was sky high and rape was routine. So it's, this current refugee camp, Dadaab in Kenya, was built, housed about 5 times as many people as it was intended to host. Again, I mentioned gender-based violence is horrific and so normalized that a UN officer could say, what's so terrible about rape? You don't die from it. And you think, well, why do people stay in camps? It's the only way you can be chosen for resettlement. But increasingly, refugees are very connected. They're in touch with each other over WhatsApp. They know what's going on. And they understand that, yes, they could hope for resettlement in a refugee camp, but it's small. So what other options do I have? Right? I have a 1 in 100 chance of being resettled. What else can I do? So the other thing, and since 2005, the majority of refugees have chosen to avoid refugee camps and go instead to urban settlements. So these are the major or minor cities in a country proximate to a refugee camp. And again, you might have some friends, some co-nationals who know their way around, who can let you stay with them. You're working under the table. But you're able to maintain your autonomy. But the downside is that fewer than 1 in 10 urban refugees receive any kind of aid from anyone, NGOs or the UN. Housing is bad to horrific. If you are able to work, it's often under very exploitative circumstances. And many parents will report that the worst thing is that their children simply can't be educated. Right? So this is decades of children not going to school, not being educated. So in light of those 2 options, it may be more understandable why people choose to seek asylum. Because They understand that their risk is a lot and it's dangerous, but if they can make it, if they can get to the United States, to Canada, the European Union, to Australia, then they actually have a chance at life. But of course, because of the deterrence policies, they've become extremely dangerous. What's it like to be smuggled into Europe where you face all kinds of dangers, the risk of torture, death, rape, dying in the desert, drowning at sea. But this quote from an Eritrean refugee I think is really indicative. A dead goat doesn't fear a butcher's knife. And the idea is that if you're at the point where you're trying to seek asylum, it's because you have no other option. You feel like your life is over. If you've maybe experienced torture in your home country, you've gone to a refugee camp, there's no hope. You've gone to an urban settlement, there's no hope. Well, what do you do? Well, maybe I can get to Italy, and then maybe my children can have a chance. But like, my life is over anyway, so. This is why deterrence policies will never work, because there's something in human beings that insists against all that we are told. We should keep fighting for our lives, and we should keep trying to find hope and security. So asylum continues. And what I would put forward is that this is how we should think about the global refugee crisis. Not that, oh, there's so many people coming to the United States, what are we going to do about it? But rather that the vast majority of refugees remain in these extremely impoverished conditions with profound insecurity, physical and otherwise, for an average of 17 years, with a very small chance of any actual hope for the future. You know, the other 10% take their chances of being smuggled and risk sexual assault, torture, death, etc. And what I argue in my work is that this isn't an accident. This isn't just how things happen, but it is in fact an injustice that we, as citizens of the United States and as members of the international community, have created. In my work, I talk about this as a structural injustice, but I'm going to skip over this for the sake of time. So let's come back for a minute to the U.S. migrant crisis. And what I hope is that my explanation so far has helped you to understand why migrants keep coming to the United States despite deterrence policies, and despite what deterrence policies will come in the future, despite the fact that people may be excluded from asylum, and despite the fact that we will almost certainly end the refugee resettlement program. The sheer desperation of people are going to continue to look for some kind of security wherever they can find it, no matter how badly we treat them. So you might think, let me come back to the original, we need to balance national sovereignty with human rights. What's a state to do? Like, states are actually in a hard position. How can we balance three goals, right? How can we control immigration and exercise our national sovereignty, which is a good that everyone agrees countries should have? But how can we do it in a way that respects the human rights of all people, citizens, immigrants, undocumented people? And how can we grant special protection to refugees and asylum seekers, who are a group of people that by consensus we understand to be people who have nowhere else to go and are in fact deserving of our claims to enter? So balancing national sovereignty with commitments to human rights as a global response to refugees. So you're like, well, that sounds great. How do we do that? And that is very, very tricky. Other countries have found ways to do that. It does take a lot of social trust. So I would venture then, for the next 4 years, we won't do that. But a precondition for doing that in the future is something I think we can work towards. And that's simply being honest on all sides. So first and foremost, we need to stop dehumanizing refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants more broadly. For example, it's a widely held belief, or people are widely told, that immigrants are criminals. But the data is absolutely clear on this and has been clear for decades. Immigrants, of which refugees are a subset, immigrants are no more likely to commit crime than native-born people, and often much less likely to commit crime. Like, we can just be honest about that. We don't have to villainize and dehumanize immigrants and refugees in order to talk about them. And at the same time, I think we would do well to think about the impacts of rapid migration, large-scale migration on the social fiber of life. How people feel about where they are, how people feel about their ability to exercise sovereignty. And economically, immigration does have an impact on low-wage workers. And that can't be ignored or brushed aside and just told to people to get over. Because for the people who are working hard and not getting the wages they feel they deserve, that's an injustice. So I think there is a way we can get through this, and we can balance these different goals, but honesty on all parts and an ability to take the perspective of all people who are affected by this is really important. You know, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was some good news that came out of it. It was the first case in recent history where countries actually responded ethically to refugees. Rather than putting them in camps and shutting them away, they said, look, you can have immediately temporary work permits. You can travel for free, so you can go and visit family, friends, you can find a job where you can find a job. You can have immediate access to education for your children, and you can immediately access health care, which of course in the invasion, the advent of an invasion is something that's super important. So countries can do this. They can exercise national sovereignty and balance the human rights of immigrants and make room for refugees, if there is a political will. And since I know Professor Oxley is a philosopher and I'm a philosopher, I thought I would just make a plug for why the work that we do in philosophy remains important. Because you might think, like, okay, that all sounds good, moral obligations, blah, blah, blah. But politics is politics, and realism is, you know, what God is today. And it's foolish to talk about moral obligations. The native backlash against immigration is so strong that nothing will stop it. But just remember, John Locke wrote the two treaties on government, and it inspires Thomas Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. Karl Marx writes Das Kapital and changes the whole world. Right? Lenin founds a government based on it, and then we spent another 100 years creating social welfare programs to try to make it sound less attractive. So I think it's worth crafting a vision of what a just world would look like, what a just U.S. immigration would look like, U.S. immigration system would look like. If not for the present moment, then hopefully sometime in the very near future. I'm going to stop there.
Okay, so we've got about 15 minutes for questions, and she's going to field them, so just raise your hand, and she'll call on you when she sees you.
The purple shirt, thank you for all the heads on.
Do you think that we don't treat impoverished people such as refugees because we believe that they would provide value to our country?
Can you say that again?
I said, do you think that we don't treat impoverished people, like the systemic issue is treating poor people bad in general in this country, such as refugees, because this country has a belief that poor people provide no value to society?
It's possible, but I think it's more complicated than that. I wonder sometimes if that's not the reason we do it, or the justification for doing it. I mean, I think there's a lot of economic interests that are served by keeping that structure in place. There's a sort of deep history of inequality in our country that we've never really grappled with. So I do think it's complicated. It used to be the case that everyone, Republican and Democrat alike, agreed that refugees had value. And in fact, the U.S. resettlement program was the pride and joy of Republicans. Until President Obama, Republicans resettled more refugees than Democrats. And the idea was, like, look, refugees are just poor, suffering people, like you and I might have been in generations past. And what makes us great is our generosity. So it's an example of what a good country we are to help refugees. They come here at the most in one generation. They're economically sustainable and putting more into the country than they are taking out. So the shift to demonizing refugees is a really, really recent shift, which is why we can remember that it doesn't have to be this way, and it wasn't always this way. Yeah.
So of all of our moral and legal obligations, do any of them change for countries who are not part of the United Nations?
There are countries that are not part of the United Nations. But not all countries have signed the UN Refugee Convention. And they have different obligations. Some human rights documents are considered part of customary international law, which just means that the norms that are in them are so strong that countries are expected to uphold them, whether or not they sort of formally sign on to them. But what's interesting is that some of the countries that are not part of the UN Refugee Convention are some of the countries that are most generous to refugees. Like Lebanon, 1 in 5 people in Lebanon is a refugee. And even when they've gone through these incredible economic tumultuous times, refugees do get blamed, but they still allow them to come in. They don't call them refugees. And they don't say, we're letting you in because we have a legal obligation. They say, you're brothers. Of course we're going to do this. So they have a different rationale, a different way of responding, but by many measures actually do a much better job. But they're not part of this international system that works together to find solutions for refugees. But the actual international landscape is very, very interesting in that regard. Yeah, back.
Can you think of any moral deterrence policies the U.S. could integrate that we currently aren't using?
Sure. I can give you an example of a kind of neutral one. Early on, when legal immigration started to be restricted, and this is like the 80s and 90s, both in the United States and in Europe. And this is when illegal immigration becomes more common. We have larger rates of illegal immigration coming. Countries started to penalize carriers for transporting people who didn't have visas. So, if you've ever gone to another country and you've gotten a visa, and like United Airlines checks your visa before you get on a plane, that's because of this deterrence policy. It was meant to make it harder to come to the US and Europe through legal means. If you're a refugee, that's why you have to go legally, because you can't buy a plane ticket. But you can imagine a situation in which, this is an example of a deterrence policy, but you could, so I mentioned that there's a 4-year asylum wait. And, at the end of that 4 years, you could be found to not be an asylum seeker and then be deportable. So instead of having this backlog, you could imagine a situation where people trained status determination judges. So these are people who particularly focus on determining asylum status for refugees, and put 10 times more, 100 times more of these judges in place at the border communities. So you could have, a fair and ethical status determination process, but one that's much quicker. And then if it's the case that people are not asylum seekers, then they can be removed. But the U.S. has upheld its commitment to human rights and so forth. So there are definitely various ways that people can do this. Sometimes people say things like, the cruelty is the point. And the point is actually not the efficiency of these policies, because overwhelmingly the evidence suggests that they do not work. They push people to more dangerous routes and more people die, and I guess that's part of victory because fewer people make it in. But it doesn't deter the number of people who are going to come, and it does not deter the overall number of displaced people who, if they're not here, they're there. If they're not here, they're somewhere else. They're waiting to come in 6 months later or a year later. So it doesn't really change the overall landscape. It might just blur the numbers for a short period of time. So deterrence policies don't work. There are different things that could work, absolutely. Yeah.
Is it difficult in the U.S. to apply for a work visa? Or is it difficult?
Yes. Yeah. So if you are, if you're a refugee, you come in through the resettlement program, you get a work visa. If you're an asylum seeker, while you're waiting for asylum, you can have a work visa. If you are an unauthorized immigrant and you enter without documentation, or you overstay your visa, you come in as a student and then you don't leave when you're supposed to, it is impossible to get a work visa. You cannot get it because you're here illegally, as it were. So that's why you have to remain undocumented. There are ways of, I'm blanking on the name, of fixing your status, but they are very, very hard. And the law is designed to be punitive to anyone who is here illegally. And the problem is that if you're a highly skilled worker, so we hire foreign-born people all the time, and we work with them. We have a whole legal team to help them get the visas that they need to work legally in the United States. And it's doable. So there are H-1B visas, J-1 visas for highly skilled individuals. But if you are a farm worker and you want to work in the United States for 6 months picking apples, there's no visa you can apply for. There's no work authorization. There's no, sometimes people say you have to get in the queue, but there's no queue. Like there's no way to actually get legal authorization to do those skilled work. There used to be in the past, and people have tried to suggest there should be ways in the future, but right now there's not. Yeah.
Can you talk more about some of the common opposition towards allowing refugees and immigrants into the country? We talked a lot about how, in the recent discourse, like the Republicans are opposed, but can you speak more to their reasoning as to why?
It's tricky. I think, I think I mentioned that there's a whole host of reasons you could point to. Some of them I take to be good reasons, like reasons that have a rationality to them, and some I take to be reasons that are based largely in unsubstantiated fears and claims and xenophobia. So I don't think those are good reasons. We all know sort of famous like inflammatory comments about immigrants, claims that immigrants are criminals and that we have to protect ourselves from. So those are just not based in fact, like they're contrary to actual documented fact. And so I take those to not be good reasons. But probably the best reason I could imagine is something like the people in my constituency see that a lot of people who are undocumented are coming into our communities, and it's changing the character of them, which is true. People who say work in construction used to be able to get $20 an hour to do a job. Now there's all these people who are willing to work for $5 a job and they can't get work and they're really mad at that. I think that's also true. And just the sense that like, what's happened? We didn't agree to this. All of a sudden it's being foisted on our community. And then certain border communities were absolutely impacted more than other communities. I think those to be legitimate concerns of a democratic country. Like you really do need to address how immigration is going to affect people. Because there's immigration and there's integration. And countries do have obligations to also help immigrants integrate in society. And without that, you're going to have these cases where people are just very frustrated with what's going on and want to reject that. So broadly speaking, I think that aligns with the idea of political self-determination. As a country, as a constituency, we get to determine our area. We shouldn't be forced to have people that we didn't want to begin with. But again, in the best circumstances, that usually goes along with something like, but we will respect their human rights, but we will still treat them with human dignity, however we can. Please.
When I heard that one of the pushbacks from people is that, especially we want to be compassionate to all these refugees, it's a matter of capacity, whether or not we can actually sustain this huge number. Is there an increase that you think, or is that just a matter of our current infrastructure is flawed, and we're having people planned up really tight, and we can do better on that front? So it's a large country, of course.
Yeah, great question. And I think your question actually pointed to the answer. So the question of capacity, or the rebuttal of capacity, is one of those rebuttals that does have a kernel of truth to it. But a kernel of truth. So absolutely, if they're, like some countries really are just physically limited if they can take it. But then it's also socially constructed. So what does it mean that we don't have the capacity? I mentioned Lebanon, tiny, tiny country where 1 in 5 people are refugees, and they have not closed their borders to refugees, despite what was an influx of millions of people after the Syrian, hundreds of thousands, close to 1 million people after the Syrian civil war. So they understood their capacity to be very different than we would understand our capacity to be. But given that, I think it is something to be addressed. Right? If people feel like, I need 3,000 square feet, otherwise I'm going to feel like, we're out of space. That's something to take seriously. And the idea of how we think about immigration in relation to other social issues like housing is really important. Like if you're in a community where there's no affordable housing, and then you see it being used to support people who are not citizens, I can understand the resentment that would come from that. You're like, I can't afford an apartment, why did they get an apartment? So it is something to be addressed, but the understanding, like you said, it is something we could do something about if we wanted to. Economically, And the economists sometimes say that immigration is the $1 trillion bill that's left on the ground. You know this phenomenon in economics. If you see a dollar bill on the ground, you'll pick it up. But if you see a $50 bill, you won't pick it up because you think like, oh, that's weird. Someone's going to come back for it. Like, I shouldn't do that. And so you'll walk by $50 and not $1. So in other words, immigration would be a huge economic boon if it was done right, if we could actually integrate people successfully, if we could allay people's social fears about the outsider and how it's going to impact their community and so forth. And in that respect, capacity would be made better by immigration. So when you have immigrants, you have bigger markets, you have, there are a lot of ways in which once you get past the short-term challenges, they improve communities. So then you have more housing, more people to build the housing, and more markets and stores and opportunities for people to buy and sell their goods and so forth. And it can, in fact, be increased in that way. Sure.
Do you think it's at all practical, like we see, kind of short-term areas, this like sanctuary cities, right, where instead of perhaps trying to get these people to already two packed areas of New York or get them more towards that Midwestern kind of Rust Belt area that is very much open by any aside from getting people on board, that's a whole other.
So yes, great.
Right, convincing them to know that, but assuming they agree with that.
Absolutely. The refugee resettlement program often puts people in communities like there's a big Somali community in Minnesota, as we know about from MLR. That's from the refugee resettlement program. What are they doing there? How do they survive? Like, how do they integrate? But the thing is where they are, the other thing that happens is, so you're somewhere with there's more capacity, which is great, absolutely doable. But then it tends to be the case that once people get to know refugees and immigrants, they stop disliking them. So we tend to dislike refugees in the abstract, but everyone likes the refugee that they know. So once you have people in your communities, distrust of refugees tends to go down, and there tends to be more openness to that. So absolutely, and I think most refugees would be perfectly happy to go along with that as well. I mean, like, there's somewhere we can go where we can work, and we can have a house, and people will be happy with us being there. Like, we'll take it. I see your hand. I'm just going to see if there's anyone else who wants to ask a question that's had a chance. Please.
On the ethical ground, how do you think that how we can bridge the gap between the perception that refugees are creating threat to national sovereignty, which I really have talked about in your presentation, that how they can be seen as an actual contribution to the society, and what measures can governments and civil society can implement to address the fear and the issues like populism, especially in emerging concepts like the United States nationalist and protectionist policies towards refugees. So how do you see this?
That's such an important question, and it's a tough moment to answer it. My answer would be stories. Facts tend to not move people. Like if you are predisposed to being afraid of a refugee, I could tell you all day, I give you all the statistics of crime and terrorism, and you won't change your mind. But once you start hearing about who they are and so on, if you have a chance to meet refugees, that's another incredible way that people can be persuaded to be more open to that. But I think we're at a moment right now where people are closed and they're not interested in hearing all about that. If it makes me feel better to remind myself that these are always cyclical. So pushback against immigration is always followed by pushback against anti-immigration. So there will be a moment again when civil society can have play a large role in thinking, talking to people. And I would just advocate for a lot of sympathy and empathy for people who are feeling hurt, afraid, challenged by immigrants. And to not just dismiss it as like you're dumb or ignorant or something like that, but to really be open to their concerns and to really hear them and to try to create space through talking about people as human beings. I think that's the most powerful way to just pass on the message that they're human beings. There's time for one more question. Maybe I can just take the questions and then we can just answer them. Sure. Okay, go ahead and then I'll
I was just going to ask, do you think the war on terror taken up by Western countries could potentially negate or even lessen the necessity for refuge or asylum seekers in the future? Or is it just...
Did you say the war on terror?
Yeah, like the war on terror, or just going overseas and fighting, does that cause any lessening, or is it just for us to seem bigger on the world view?
Great, I'll come back to that. Yeah,
I was just gonna ask if there are any current estimates for how many refugees there are globally.
that's an easy one, a little over 20 million.
I just wanted to this is like statement or question. Just want to state that Malthusian argument behind the surplus of population has been disproven time and time after again. If you look at China, the whole they have a much higher population density than America does, and they're arguably more successful than we are now, which is a sad reality we have to come to realize too. But my point of my question is, if deterrence policies do not work, what rehabilitation policies would you implement to improve our country?
Okay, so to go back to the war on terror question, when you said at the very end was the case, they have not historically succeeded in making things better. The larger argument is something like this: look, if they're going to be refugees, we should go after the core reason that people are being made refugees. Like, let's go after the unstable countries, let's stop the wars, let's stop the famine, and so forth. And my answer is always we should be doing both. We still will always have refugees and we have to take care of them. We should be looking at the core issues, but we need to look at them not in terms of fixing other countries, but thinking about the structure of the international system and trying to understand why countries still remain without full sovereignty, and why resources are being siphoned from poorer countries to richer countries and not the other way around. Afghanistan initially actually produced a lot of refugees. Then when the U.S. was occupying it, a lot of refugees were able to come home. Then when we left, they were made refugees again. So it's not a stable solution to refugees. And even if it were, we still have the 20 million refugees that we would be dealing with. And the question, remember your question again?
If deterrence policies do not work, what rehabilitation policies would you implement?
So some kind of global agreement on how to address the situation from a global perspective, where all countries try to determine what a fair share would be, and to think about how we can determine asylum without having people take dangerous, difficult journeys. So for example, you can imagine somebody being able to claim this U.S. asylum at the embassy in Kabul. And you might think, well, they'll be overwhelmed, but they can actually assess their asylum claims and then be able to bring them over in a way that would be more orderly. They can balance what other countries are doing with different kinds of foreign policy objectives. That's at least what was envisioned at the end of the Second World War. And is no more impossible than any other global issue that we've been able to succeed on. I think we need to wrap up. That's okay. We can talk after if you like.
Yeah, and I'll just add one comment. I visited my first refugee camp in East Africa in 1999, Cognega Refugee Camp, which is the largest one in Africa, and it's a life-changing experience. And we don't get to visit refugee camps because there's none here. They're all, as she said, in the global south, so in Africa and South Asia. There are films about this, so if you could look up some films on refugees, I know that Serena has some recommendations. You can really get a sense for why people are leaving their countries. Like, they don't have food, they don't have water, there's mortars and bombs being dropped everywhere, and their life is unsustainable. So that's why they're willing to go live in a plastic tent city. So I think it's important to understand where people are coming from and what they're willing to do to try to become part of a society where they can just have their kids at home and trade and make friends with their neighbor. It seems so simple because we have that every day, and it's amazing that 20 million people in the world don't have a shot at that. So anyway, I want to thank you for coming, and please share what you learned here today with some neighbor as you leave and as you go forth tonight. This concludes our programming for the Jackson Center for the semester, but we'll have some more events next semester. Let's thank Dr. Franklin.